Some disasters are etched in our memory forever. The DC-10 in Chicago, the collision over San Diego, the frozen Potomac, the skies over New York, and the miracle on the Hudson. In this documentary, we analyze 10 pivotal U.S. crashes that redefined aviation safety. We go beyond the headlines to understand what happened in the cockpit and how these tragedies made flying safer. This is Terra Obscura. For calm, detailed aviation history, please like and subscribe. It is the afternoon of May 25, 1979, at Chicago O'Hare. American Airlines Flight 191 is getting ready to leave for Los Angeles. The airplane is a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a wide-body jet that is supposed to be the future of long-haul flying. The weather is good, visibility is fine, and to the passengers this is just a normal departure from one of the busiest airports in the United States. On board are 271 people. In the cabin, people settle into their seats, put bags in the overhead bins, and fasten seatbelts almost on autopilot. Some are on business trips, some are going home, some are starting holidays. In the cockpit, the crew work through the takeoff checklist. Nothing on the instrument suggests that this flight will be different from thousands of others that left O'Hare that day. Flight 191 taxis out and lines up on the runway. When tower gives clearance, the captain smoothly advances all three thrust levers. The engines spool up, the aircraft starts to accelerate, and the centerline markings slide under the nose. From the cabin, it feels like every other takeoff. As the jet reaches takeoff speed, the captain gently pulls back. The nose lifts into the air, and the main wheels begin to lighten. For a few seconds, the wide body is in that thin layer between ground and sky, just starting to climb away from Chicago. Then on the left side, the disaster happens. The entire left engine and the pylon that connects it to the wing tear away from the airplane. The engine does not simply drop off. It first swings up over the wing, ripping through hydraulic lines and damaging the front edge of the wing, then falls to the runway and tumbles along the side of the aircraft. Pieces of metal and fuel spray outward. In the cockpit, warning lights and cautions appear almost at once. In the cabin, people on the left side hear a bang and feel a violent jolt, but the airplane is already airborne and climbing. From the ground, witnesses see something that should never happen. The jet is just above the runway, gear retracting, but there is a trail of fuel and pieces behind the left wing. Because of the structural damage, some of the devices on the leading edge of that wing, which are supposed to stay extended to give extra lift at low speed, pull back when they lose hydraulic pressure. Suddenly, the left and right wings no longer produce the same lift. Inside the cockpit, the crew lose important instruments on the captain's side because the separated engine has taken wiring and systems with it. They know they have lost an engine, but they do not immediately see the full structural damage on the left wing. Procedures for losing a single engine after takeoff are well known. In theory, the jet should still be flyable. In reality, this is not a normal engine failure. The jet keeps climbing for a short distance, but the damaged left wing is already close to stalling. Lift on that side collapses first. The airplane begins to roll to the left. The pilots apply opposite controls, trying to keep the wings level, but with one wing partly stalled and the other still producing strong lift, the imbalance is too strong. The bank angle increases. The nose starts to drop. Very quickly, the aircraft moves from a shallow climb to a steep descending turn. From the runway area and nearby roads, people watch in shock as the jet rolls farther onto its side. It never reaches a safe altitude. There is no time and no height to recover. Only about half a minute after liftoff, American Airlines Flight 191 rolls almost fully onto its left side and crashes into an open field just beyond the end of the runway, near a trailer park and an industrial area. The impact is devastating. The airplane breaks apart and explodes in a massive fireball. A thick black column of smoke rises over O'Hare and is visible for kilometers around Chicago. There are no survivors on board. 2 people on the ground are also killed, with 273 fatalities in total. This becomes the deadliest aviation accident in United States history. The investigation quickly focuses on the missing engine and pylon found back on the airfield, separate from the main wreckage. That single fact proves that the engine separated before impact, not because of it. Engineers and investigators examine the pylon structure in detail and uncover cracks and damage that had started earlier during maintenance. At the time, to save time and money, some operators had used a shortcut method to remove and reinstall the engine and pylon together as one unit, instead of separately as the manufacturer originally intended. That procedure could put extra bending loads on the pylon attachment points. Over time, these loads caused hidden structural damage until the mounting finally failed under takeoff stress. When the attachment broke on Flight 191, it did more than remove one source of thrust. The separation ripped lines and actuators that controlled the high-lift devices on the left wing and damaged parts of the hydraulic system. The aeroplane's design and the specific failure mode combined to produce a situation that looked like a normal engine failure on some cockpit instruments, but was actually a deep aerodynamic and structural crisis. At that low height, with that degree of damage, the crew had almost no chance to save the airplane. Air Florida Flight 90 was supposed to be a simple winter flight to Florida. On January 13, 1982, A Boeing 737 sat at Washington National Airport, ready to depart for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa. There were 79 people on board. 74 passengers and 5 crew. Outside, a heavy snowstorm covered the city. The Potomac River beside the airport was a field of broken ice. Because of the storm, the airport closed for a time, then reopened. Flight 90 was sprayed with de-icing fluid at the gate, but after that, the airplane waited in falling snow and slush longer than planned. As they taxied out, the crew used reverse thrust behind other jets, hoping the hot exhaust from aircraft ahead would help clear remaining snow. In reality, that choice blew slush and ice back onto the wings and into the engines. They also left the engine anti-ice system off, even though the temperature and visible moisture clearly called for it. On the way to the runway, the first officer noticed that the engine power readings did not look right for the conditions. The numbers were too high for the way the engines sounded and felt. He mentioned it, but the captain pressed on. There had already been delays. Snow was still falling. Instead of stopping to recheck the engines or return for more de-icing, they continued toward takeoff. When the tower cleared them, the 737 rolled down the slushy runway, and the captain advanced the thrust levers. Because ice had built up on engine probes, the instruments showed higher power than the engines were really producing. At the same time, a thin layer of ice and snow remained on the wings, quietly destroying lift. The crew thought they had full thrust and clean wings. They had neither. The airplane reached rotation speed and lifted off. Almost immediately, the climb felt wrong. The jet struggled to gain height. The speed stopped increasing. Stall warnings sounded as the wings, coated in contamination and fed by reduced power, could not make enough lift. Just beyond the end of the runway, the 14th Street Bridge crossed the Potomac, full of cars and buses moving slowly in the snow. With barely any climb performance left, Flight 90 sank toward the bridge. The landing gear and lower fuselage slammed into the guardrail and vehicles. Several cars and a truck were crushed. 4 people on the bridge were killed. The impact tore pieces off the wings and fuselage. Then the jet slid off the edge, broke apart and plunged into the frozen river. Most of the airplane disappeared under the ice. Only a section of the tail and part of the cabin remained above the water, surrounded by jagged pieces of ice and fuel film. A handful of survivors managed to escape their seats and reach open windows. They clung to wreckage and water just above freezing, unable to swim far or pull themselves onto stable ice. On the shore and the bridge, people watched in shock. Emergency vehicles fought through snow and traffic to reach the riverbank. Even when they arrived, rescuers could not simply wade out through the ice. The current was strong. Anyone who went in risked quickly losing strength and disappearing under broken ice. A United States Park Police helicopter arrived and began hovering low over the river. The crew lowered a rescue line again and again toward the survivors in the water. In the end, only 5 people from the airplane survived. 74 passengers and crew, plus 4 people on the bridge, lost their lives. The images that went around the world were not only of wreckage, they showed a torn tail standing in a field of ice, a helicopter hovering inches above the water, and exhausted survivors being dragged across snow and broken ice to the shore. Investigators later found no single hidden defect that made the crash unavoidable. The key causes were human and procedural. The crew took off with ice on critical surfaces, did not use engine anti-ice, trusted power readings from iced probes, and did not reject the takeoff when their instruments looked wrong. Ground de-icing practices and training also fell short of what the conditions demanded. Out of the Potomac disaster came stricter rules for winter operations across the United States. Airlines tightened de-icing procedures, changed checklists, and reinforced a simple rule for crews. If there is any doubt about contamination on the wings, the airplane does not leave the ground. Delta Airlines Flight 191 was meant to be a routine evening stop on the way from Fort Lauderdale to Los Angeles. On August 2, 1985, the wide-body trijet was descending toward Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with 163 people on board. Thunderstorms were sitting near the airport with dark clouds and rain shafts just off the approach to runway 17 left. From the cockpit, the crew could see lightning ahead but decided to continue. The plan was to slip under the edge of the storm and get in before it grew worse. On final approach, gear down and flaps set, they flew into a curtain of heavy rain hanging from the cloud base. At first, the airspeed jumped. The airplane had flown into a strong headwind, the front side of a microburst. To stay on the glide path, the pilots pulled the power back. Seconds later, everything flipped. The headwind collapsed into a tailwind, and a powerful downdraft shoved the jet toward the ground. The airspeed dropped, lift disappeared, and the airplane started sinking fast. In the cockpit, one pilot warned, "Watch your speed," and the captain urged more power. But by the time the thrust levers went fully forward, they were already too low and too deep inside the microburst to climb out. Short of the runway, the jet slammed into an open field north of a highway. The main landing gear gouged through the wet ground, then the aircraft bounced and skidded toward Texas State Highway 114. It struck a car on the road, killing the driver, then broke apart as it crossed the highway, hit light poles, and finally smashed into 2 large water tanks at the edge of the airport. The front 2/3 of the fuselage disintegrated in a fireball. Only the tail section separated relatively intact and slid backward into the rain-soaked grass. Airport fire crews reached the wreckage within minutes and found debris scattered over a wide area, burning fuel, twisted metal, and the torn tail lying on its side. In the rear cabin, a small group of passengers were still alive, many of them in the last rows. Rescuers climbed into the broken structure, cut people free, and carried them out in heavy rain and intense heat. Out of 163 people on board, 137 died, along with the driver of the car on the highway. 27 occupants survived, most of them from the very back of the cabin. Investigators later concluded that there was nothing mysteriously wrong with the engines or controls. The core of the accident was the decision to continue the approach into a thunderstorm and the lack of clear training and tools to recognize and escape a microburst at low altitude. At that time, cockpit radar could show rain, but not the dangerous wind patterns inside. Airlines also did not yet have standard escape procedures for sudden wind shear near the ground. It is the morning of September 25, 1978, over San Diego, California. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 is on the last minutes of a routine trip, descending toward Lindbergh Field. The airplane is a Boeing 727 packed with passengers, crew, and a few off-duty PSA employees sitting in the cabin. The weather is clear. Sunlight, blue sky, scattered clouds. From a passenger seat, San Diego looks calm and close. People lean toward the windows to see the houses and streets as the 727 turns toward the airport. Sharing that same sky is a much smaller airplane, a Cessna 172 on a training flight. On board are a flight instructor and a student pilot practicing approaches. They are under radar control, climbing and turning as instructed, in the same general area where PSA 182 is being vectored for landing. Air traffic control is trying to fit everyone into a busy morning arrival flow. The PSA 727 is given vectors for a visual approach. Controllers point out the small Cessna traffic. In the cockpit of the 727, the crew report that they have the Cessna in sight and say they will maintain visual separation. That sentence is important. It means that from that moment, the jet's crew are partly responsible for keeping clear of the smaller plane. The 727 continues descending toward the airport. The crew discuss the position of the Cessna, looking out of the cockpit windows. At one point, one of them mentions that they no longer see it clearly. They assume it is still ahead and below. They do not call this loss of visual contact clearly to air traffic control. The controller believes the PSA crew still have the other aircraft in sight. What none of them realize is that the smaller Cessna has drifted into a very dangerous spot, directly below and slightly ahead of the descending 727, hidden in the blind area under the nose and in front of the wing. From inside the jet, there is now no way to see the Cessna at all. The 727 continues its descent, wings nearly level, engines at approach power, checklists in progress. The crew are talking about the approach, the runway, and their position over the city. Passengers looking out the windows see the suburbs of San Diego passing underneath, cars on the roads, small houses with pools and backyards. Nothing about the scene suggests that 2 aircraft are on a collision course. Then, in a split second, the Boeing 727 and the Cessna 172 try to occupy the same piece of air. The larger jet's right wing and engine slice through the smaller airplane. The Cessna is torn apart instantly. There is no time for a radio call, no chance for the crew of the small aircraft to react. Debris showers downward. On the 727, the impact is violent. The right wing is badly damaged. Fuel may start to leak. The structure that keeps the aircraft stable in flight is suddenly not the same. Inside the cockpit, the crew are thrown in their seats. Warning lights and alarms appear. The aircraft begins to roll and pitch in ways they did not command. From the ground, a photographer captures one of the most haunting images in aviation history. PSA 182 in a steep, nose-down attitude, trailing smoke and fuel, clearly out of control, seconds before impact. In the cabin, the experience is beyond words. The level airplane suddenly drops its nose and rolls, throwing passengers, loose items, and even seats around. Some may see flames or parts of the wing out the window. Others are pinned to the sides of the cabin by the G-forces of the developing dive. There is almost no time to understand what is happening. The 727 dives into the North Park neighborhood of San Diego. It hits the ground with enormous speed in the middle of a residential area, destroying houses, cars, and everything in its immediate path. The impact and fire kill everyone on board the jet, the 2 people in the Cessna, and several people on the ground. In total, 144 lives are lost. Fire and rescue crews race into the streets, but there is little they can do beyond fighting fires and searching the debris for survivors. The crash scene looks less like a recognizable airplane and more like scattered metal and burned fragments spread through an urban block. For the residents of North Park, this is not an abstract plane crash. It is a disaster that arrives literally in their front yards. Investigators now have to understand how, in clear weather, 2 two aircraft under radar control ended up colliding over a major city. They reconstruct radar tracks, listen to the cockpit voice recorder and tower tapes, and study the view from the 727's cockpit. They confirmed that air traffic control pointed out the Cessna, and the PSA crew reported it in sight. After that, the controller relied on the see and avoid principle, expecting the jet crew to keep the smaller traffic in view. But the geometry of the turn, the altitude, and the relative positions of both aircraft meant that the Cessna slipped out of sight beneath the nose. The crew mentioned losing sight of the smaller airplane to each other, but never clearly told the controller traffic no longer in sight. At the same time, the controller's mental picture of the situation was not perfect. He believed the two aircraft still had enough vertical and horizontal separation and did not issue a specific avoidance vector. The investigation also notes that the airspace around San Diego was busy, with a mix of airline traffic and small training aircraft sharing the same arrival paths. The rules and tools of the time put a lot of weight on human eyes and judgment, both in the cockpit and in the tower. The result was a chain of normal decisions that set up an abnormal tragedy, a visual approach, a traffic call, a confirmation that we have it in sight, a moment when that was no longer true, and a lack of hard electronic protection to keep two radar blips from ever merging. Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 becomes a turning point. The accident pushes regulators and manufacturers toward more advanced collision avoidance systems, eventually leading to the traffic alert and collision avoidance system that airliners use today. It drives changes in how controllers handle mixed traffic in busy terminal areas and how clearly crews must report when they lose sight of another aircraft they are supposed to follow. For most people, though, the memory of PSA 182 is still tied to two images: a 727 caught in a near vertical dive above a quiet neighborhood, and a San Diego street filled with wreckage and fire. Behind those pictures is one of the clearest lessons in American aviation history. Good weather and a clear day are not enough to keep the sky safe if there is nothing between we see the other plane and we hit it, except human memory and a quick glance through a window. Northwest Airlines Flight 255 was supposed to be just another summer evening departure out of Detroit. The airplane was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, getting ready to leave Detroit Metro Airport on August 16, 1987, for a flight toward Phoenix. Families were heading home from holidays, kids were half asleep in their seats, and the sun was starting to go down over the airport. On the ramp, it was busy and hot. Turnaround times were tight, and the crew had already flown earlier legs that day. In the cockpit, they had checklists to run, performance data to set, and a departure slot to make. On paper, nothing about this flight looked unusual. But in those minutes before takeoff, something critical went wrong. The MD-82 was configured for departure, but the wing flaps and slats, which must be extended for takeoff to provide extra lift at low speed, were never actually set. On this type of aircraft, if the crew advanced the throttles for takeoff with the flaps still up, a warning system is supposed to sound an alarm. That alarm never came. Out in the cabin, no one could see any of this. Passengers saw only a normal boarding, a normal pushback, and the slow taxi to the runway. Seatbelts clicked. The usual announcements played. People looked out at the fading light and the line of airplanes waiting to depart. Flight 255 lined up on the runway at Detroit. When the tower cleared them for takeoff, the captain advanced the throttles. The engines wound up to take off power. The aircraft began to accelerate, nose pointed down the center line, runway lights stretching ahead. Inside the cockpit, the crew called out the speeds as they increased. The numbers on the airspeed indicator reached the point for rotation. The captain pulled back on the control column, and the nose came up. The MD-82 lifted off the ground and started to climb, but it did not climb the way a properly configured airliner should. With the flaps and slats still retracted, the wings were not generating enough lift for such a heavy airplane at that speed. The jet was just barely flying, with almost no margin between its actual speed and the stall speed. Almost immediately after liftoff, the aircraft began to struggle. The angle of climb was shallow and unsteady. Then the wings reached a critical angle and the airflow broke away. The airplane stalled while still extremely low over the ground. The MD-82 rolled and sank back toward the earth. Seconds later, the aircraft hit obstacles just beyond the end of the runway. It struck light poles and then slammed into a road near the airport, crushing and burning several cars as it broke apart. The wreckage scattered across Middle Belt Road and into nearby land, erupting in fire. The impact and fire were catastrophic. Out of everyone on board, only one passenger, a young girl, survived the crash. All the other passengers and crew died. Several people in vehicles on the road were also killed. In total, more than 150 lives were lost in just a few seconds of failed climb. Investigators went back through every step of the flight's preparation and takeoff roll. They confirmed from the flight data and wreckage that the flaps and slats had never been extended. They also confirmed that the takeoff configuration warning, which should have sounded when the throttles were advanced with an unsafe configuration, did not activate. The investigation focused on checklist discipline, cockpit workload, and the technical details of how that warning system received its power. The final picture was a chain of human and technical factors. A rushed and complex cockpit environment, a missed checklist item that left the wings clean, and a safety system that failed to provide the last barrier of warning when it was needed most. With no flaps, no slats, and no warning, the MD-82 left the ground in a condition where it simply could not keep flying. On July 19, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 left Denver for Chicago as a routine mid-country trip. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a wide-body trijet that hundreds of thousands of passengers flew on every year without ever learning its model name. The weather over the Midwest was good. Passengers were relaxed, the seatbelt sign was off, and the flight was in cruise at high altitude. Somewhere over Iowa, everything changed in a fraction of a second. At the very back of the airplane, inside the tail-mounted engine, a large metal fan disc suddenly broke apart at high speed. It did not just crack, it exploded. Heavy fragments shot outward like shrapnel. They did exactly what the designers never wanted them to do. They sliced through the tail section and cut into all three of the airplane's hydraulic systems. On most large jets, hydraulic fluid under pressure is what moves the big control surfaces, the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. You can steer a car when the power steering fails, even if it is heavy. A DC-10 is not like that. Without hydraulics, the pilot's controls are almost completely disconnected from the huge surfaces on the wings and tail. In less than a second, Flight 232 lost all three hydraulic systems. In the cockpit, the crew heard a loud bang and felt a strong vibration. Warning lights came alive on the panels. Instruments showed that the tail engine had failed. That alone was serious, but survivable. What truly terrified the crew was what came next. Hydraulic quantity and pressure indicators started dropping. The controls felt strange. The airplane began to bank and pitch on its own. They tried to correct with the yoke and pedals. Nothing happened. The DC-10 started a slow but steady right roll and nose-down tendency. The pilots quickly realized they were dealing with something they had never trained for, a total hydraulic failure. In the manuals, this kind of failure was considered so unlikely that it was not covered as a realistic scenario. The airplane they were now flying simply was not supposed to exist. In the cabin, passengers noticed only that the airplane suddenly felt unstable. The gentle cruise was gone, replaced by vibrations and uncommanded turns. Drinks moved in cups. People looked around, sensing that something was wrong, but without any clear idea of what had just happened behind the cockpit door. Up front, the crew fought to regain control. They discovered that they could influence the aircraft's attitude using only engine thrust. By adding power on one wing and reducing it on the other, they could force the airplane to roll left or right. By pushing both remaining engines to higher or lower thrust, they could make the nose pitch up or down. It was crude, delayed, and imprecise, but it was something. A DC-10 instructor who happened to be traveling in the cabin was invited into the cockpit to help. Together, the captain, first officer, flight engineer, and instructor split the workload. One focused on the throttles, one called out the aircraft's attitude and speed, and the others handled radios and planning. They asked for an immediate diversion and were vectored toward Sioux City, Iowa, one of the nearest airports with a long, wide runway. As they descended, the crew tried several gentle turns and level-offs, learning how the crippled aircraft responded. The DC-10 did not fly like an airplane anymore. It behaved more like a heavy object that could be nudged but not precisely steered. Every input on the engines took a few seconds to have an effect. Every correction risked overshooting, which meant another correction in the opposite direction. They managed to get lined up roughly with the runway at Sioux City. Fire trucks and ambulances were already in position. Airport staff and emergency teams had been warned that a large jet with serious control problems was coming in for an emergency landing. On final approach, the limitations of engine-only control became even more obvious. The DC-10 would not hold a steady glide. It drifted above and below the desired path. The nose bobbed up and down. The wings slowly rocked. The crew worked the throttles constantly, trying to keep the nose from dropping too far and the bank angle from becoming too steep. They knew they were going to hit hard. The only question was how hard, and whether any part of the airplane would remain intact enough to give people a chance to survive. As the runway rushed up, the aircraft was still descending too fast and slightly right-wing low. There was no way to flare like a normal landing. The right wing and engine hit the ground first. The landing gear collapsed. The DC-10 slammed onto the runway and began to cartwheel and break apart. From the cabin, the impact was beyond violent. Seats tore loose. Overhead bins exploded open. The fuselage split and rolled. Some sections of the aircraft were crushed. Others were ripped open and thrown clear. Fire broke out in parts of the wreckage, fed by fuel from the broken wings and tanks. Yet, incredibly, not everyone died. Of the 296 people on board, 111 lost their lives. But 185 survived a crash that many experts initially thought should have been unsurvivable. The pattern of destruction was uneven. Some parts of the fuselage were completely destroyed, while other sections remained relatively intact, allowing passengers and crew to escape or be rescued. Firefighters and medical teams who had been waiting at Sioux City ran into the debris field and began pulling survivors out, working in smoke, heat, and the risk of further explosions. The investigation into United Airlines Flight 232 focused on two big questions: why the engine failed the way it did, and how a single event could destroy all three hydraulic systems that were supposed to be separated for safety. Metallurgical analysis showed that the fan disc in the tail engine had a tiny internal flaw from its manufacturing process, a defect so small that normal inspections had not detected it. Over years of service, that flaw grew into a crack under repeated stress, until it finally reached a critical size, and the disc burst apart at cruise power. Engine fragments then cut through all three hydraulic lines in the tail, which had been routed close together. In theory, three independent hydraulic systems should protect the aircraft from a total loss of control. In practice, their physical layout allowed a single uncontained engine failure to take them all out in one strike. Design changes and inspection rules followed. Engine parts of this kind would receive stricter non-destructive testing to catch hidden flaws. Aircraft designers and regulators would pay much closer attention to how independent systems were physically separated inside the structure, so that one event could not wipe them all out. Training programs around the world began to use Flight 232 as a case study in crew resource management, showing how a team can improvise under extreme pressure and still save lives in a situation their manuals never imagined. On the evening of July 17, 1996, Trans-World Airlines Flight 800 pushed back from the gate at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport as just another overnight flight to Paris. The airplane was a Boeing 747, a familiar shape at JFK, with passengers settling in for a long Atlantic crossing, families on holiday, students, tour groups, business travelers. The summer air outside was warm and hazy, the kind of July evening when the sun lingers above the Atlantic and the lights of Long Island begin to glow. From the cockpit, nothing about the departure looked unusual. The crew ran through checklists, set the route toward Europe, and taxied out among dozens of other flights. In the cabin, people adjusted seats, listened to announcements, stowed last-minute bags, and felt the heavy jet roll toward the runway. Flight attendants did the safety demonstration. Engines spooled up and the cabin vibration changed as the 747 lined up for takeoff. When tower cleared them, the captain advanced the throttles and the big jet started its takeoff roll. The runway lights blurred under the nose, the speed built, and then the airplane rotated and climbed into the summer evening, heading southeast over the Atlantic coastline. From the windows, passengers could see the shoreline and the scattering of boats on the water below, shrinking as the aircraft climbed. About 12 minutes after takeoff, Flight 800 was still in its initial climb off Long Island, passing through medium altitude, continuing to turn onto the oceanic track. Nothing on the radios or radar suggested danger. Controllers watched a normal target on their screens. The crew checked in as usual. To everyone involved, this was the most routine part of the flight. Then, without warning, the airplane broke apart in midair. People on boats and on the beaches along Long Island's south shore saw a sudden bright flash in the sky, followed by a rising fireball and falling burning debris. Some witnesses described what looked like a streak or a flare, then an explosion. Others simply saw a ball of fire appear and grow where moments earlier there had only been a line of navigation lights. Within seconds, what had been a climbing 747 was no longer an airplane at all, but a spray of burning fuel and fragments raining into the Atlantic. Inside the cabin, the transition from normal flight to disaster would have been almost instantaneous. There was no time for a controlled descent, no long series of warnings. A violent breakup at altitude does not give passengers or crew a chance to process what is happening. One moment, cruise climb and quiet conversation. The next, a structural rupture and forces far beyond what the fuselage was built to survive. Controllers watching radar screens saw the target vanish or split into multiple returns. They tried to raise Flight 800 on the radio. There was no reply. When other aircraft in the area reported a fire on the water and an explosion in the sky, the grim picture began to form. What followed was one of the largest and most complex recovery operations in aviation history. Coast Guard vessels, Navy ships, local boats and helicopters converged on the debris field off Long Island. The sea was littered with floating wreckage, luggage, seats, and personal items. Divers and recovery teams worked for months, bringing thousands of pieces of the airplane up from the seabed. All 230 people on board had died. Very quickly, the question became not just what had happened, but whether this was an accident at all. The Midair breakup, the witness reports of a streak of light, the timing so close to departure from New York, all of it led to intense public speculation about a bomb or a missile. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a criminal investigation. For a time, the work of accident investigators and criminal investigators was layered on top of each other, both sharing the same wreckage, the same radar data, and the same witness interviews, but asking slightly different questions. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board led the technical investigation. They began an extraordinarily detailed reconstruction of the airplane inside a hangar on Long Island. Piece by piece, they laid out sections of the fuselage on a frame, rebuilding the forward part of the 747 almost like a three-dimensional puzzle. The nose section, the center fuselage, the wing roots, the floor beams, and the wiring bundles all told part of the story. By examining the pattern of damage, they determined that the explosion had originated in the center wing fuel tank, located under the cabin floor near the wing root, not in the cargo hold or passenger cabin. The skin near that tank showed outward bulging, and certain structural members were bent in ways that pointed to a blast beginning inside the tank and pushing outwards. There were no classic signs of a high-energy military warhead, such as characteristic fragment patterns or metal residues from a warhead casing. Chemical tests did find traces of explosive compounds on some pieces of wreckage, but investigators traced those residues to prior training exercises and cargo contamination, rather than a device planted on Flight 800 itself. The pattern and level of damage in the center wing tank did not match a sophisticated bomb or missile. Instead, it looked like a fuel-air explosion inside a partially empty tank. The next question was how such an explosion could start. The center wing tank contained only a small amount of jet fuel at takeoff. Above that liquid fuel was a large volume of fuel vapor mixed with air. Under normal conditions, this mixture can be flammable if it is heated and if there is an ignition source. On that warm July day, environmental control systems under the cabin had been running, heating the structure around the tank and raising the temperature of the fuel and vapor inside it. That made it easier for the mixture to reach a flammable state. Fuel tanks are not supposed to have sparks or arcs inside them. Wires and components associated with fuel systems are designed so that even if they fail, they do not put enough energy into the tank to ignite vapors. Yet something on Flight 800 did exactly that. Investigators examined wiring bundles and components connected to the fuel quantity indication system for the center tank. Over time, insulation can age, chafe, and crack. On older aircraft, the wiring installed when the plane was built may not have been designed with all the later lessons about insulation breakdown and voltage spikes in mind. The most likely scenario, according to the final report, was that a short circuit outside the tank sent excess voltage into the wiring for the fuel gauge inside the tank. That electrical energy then created a spark in the flammable vapor mixture. Once ignited, the mixture inside the center wing tank burned and expanded extremely fast. The tank structure could not contain the pressure. It failed explosively, blowing apart the surrounding structure, breaking the front of the fuselage, and starting a chain reaction of structural failures that tore the airplane in two. The front section separated and fell away. The remaining parts broke up rapidly afterward. The investigation took 4 years. In the end, the official conclusion was that TWA Flight 800 was destroyed by an explosion of the center wing fuel tank, triggered by an electrical fault, not by a missile or bomb. Some people continued to believe alternative theories, but the technical evidence supported a fuel tank explosion and a wiring problem, not an external attack. On May 11, 1996, ValuJet Flight 592 left Miami for Atlanta as a short, routine domestic flight. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, filled mostly with leisure passengers starting or ending trips in Florida. The weather was good, visibility was fine, and from the outside, nothing about this departure looked unusual. The airplane pushed back, taxied out, and lined up on the runway. In the cabin, passengers listened to the safety briefing, tightened seatbelts, and felt the familiar surge of takeoff power. The DC-9 accelerated, lifted off, and began climbing away from Miami over the Everglades, a flat green and brown landscape of water and sawgrass that stretches west of the city. Inside the cockpit, the crew were busy with the standard climb checks. Everything looked normal for the first few minutes. Then, very quickly, normal disappeared. Down below the cabin floor, in the forward cargo hold, a fire had started. Inside that hold were boxes of chemical oxygen generators that had been removed from other aircraft and shipped as company material. These devices are designed to produce oxygen and heat when triggered, feeding the drop-down masks that passengers use in decompression emergencies. They were supposed to be spent and safe. In reality, several were still live, had not been properly disarmed or capped, and had been loaded in cardboard boxes along with tires and other items. During taxi and takeoff, the boxes were shaken and moved. At some point, one or more oxygen generators fired. When a generator activates, it gets extremely hot and produces pure oxygen. In a closed cargo compartment with cardboard, plastic, rubber, and other flammable material, that heat and oxygen were enough to start an intense fire. Unlike a normal cargo fire that consumes the oxygen in the compartment and then dies down, this one had its own built-in oxygen supply. A few minutes after departure, the crew started to notice problems. The cockpit voice recorder captured unusual sounds and comments. Circuit breakers popped. There were indications of electrical faults. Very soon after that, flight attendants reported smoke in the cabin. Passengers began to smell something burning and see haze, especially near the front of the aircraft. What they could not see was that the real fire was beneath their feet, attacking the structure that held up the cabin floor and the control cables that ran through it. On the radios, the pilots told air traffic control they needed to return to Miami. Their calls were urgent, but still controlled. They requested vectors back to the airport and started a turn. At this point, the airplane was still flyable, but the situation was degrading extremely fast. Smoke and heat continued to build in the forward cargo hold. The metal floor above it began to weaken. Systems routed through that area started to fail. The cabin environment worsened. Smoke spread, especially in the forward part of the aircraft. Visibility dropped. Breathing became difficult. Passengers covered their faces with clothing and tried to understand what was happening. Some may have seen smoke seeping up from floor level or felt heat under their feet. The time between the first clear signs of trouble and the end of the flight was measured in only a few minutes. Up front, the crew were now dealing with a situation no one had fully practiced, an intense hidden fire and a rapidly failing aircraft. They were still trying to get back to Miami when the DC-9's condition crossed a critical line. As the fire damaged the structure and systems in the nose and forward fuselage, the aircraft's controllability changed. On the flight data recorder, investigators later saw that the nose pitched down sharply and the descent rate increased. From radar and from witnesses on the ground, the last moments of Flight 592 were brief and violent. The aircraft entered a steep, nose-down attitude and plunged into the Everglades at high speed. There was no long, shallow descent, no extended attempt at a controlled landing. Impact shattered the airplane and drove wreckage deep into the swampy terrain. The deceleration forces were extreme. All 110 people on board were killed. The crash site was unlike a typical accident field. The swampy ground broke up and swallowed much of the structure, leaving thousands of small fragments scattered in water and mud rather than large fuselage sections. Recovery teams worked in difficult conditions, fighting heat, insects, and unstable footing to collect remains and wreckage. Even so, investigators were able to recover enough critical pieces from the cargo hold and oxygen generators to understand what had happened. The investigation traced the origin of the fire to the chemical oxygen generators in the forward cargo compartment. Many of them still contained their charge and had not been fitted with safety caps to prevent activation. They were misclassified and improperly packaged. The cargo hold itself was a Class D compartment, which at that time was allowed to have no smoke detectors and no built-in fire suppression, on the assumption that little oxygen was available and any fire would choke itself out. That assumption completely failed once multiple oxygen generators began feeding a blaze with their own continuous supply of oxygen. Responsibility did not stop with the devices. The investigation found serious problems in how the equipment had been removed, handled, and documented by a maintenance contractor, and in how ValuJet had overseen that work and its own cargo procedures. Hazardous materials regulations had been broken or ignored. Oversight from both the airline and the regulator was judged to be weak. The chain that led to the fire started months before anyone boarded Flight 592 in a maintenance shop and a paperwork trail that did not reflect the real risk of what was being loaded into the hold. On the morning of November 12, 2001, New York was still living in the shadow of September 11th. Just 2 months after the attacks, the sight of a large airliner leaving John F. Kennedy Airport carried a different weight than before. But for the people on American Airlines Flight 587, it was still, in the end, a normal flight. The destination was Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Many passengers were visiting relatives, going home, or starting holidays. The aircraft was an Airbus A300, a big twin-engine wide body that regularly flew this route. In the cabin, families spoke Spanish and English, stowed bags, settled children, and listened to the safety demonstration. Outside, the weather was clear and calm. From the cockpit, the departure looked straightforward. The crew received their clearance, taxied out, and joined the morning departure flow from JFK's long runways, stretching out toward Jamaica Bay. Ahead of them on departure was a Japan Airlines jumbo jet, a Boeing 747. Like every large aircraft, it left behind a wake of swirling air from its wingtips, invisible but very real. Controllers built some spacing between the two flights, but the American jet would still be flying through disturbed air as it climbed out over the Rockaways. Flight 587 lined up, pushed its throttles forward, and accelerated down the runway. The Airbus lifted off, retracted its landing gear, and began climbing on the standard departure path. From the windows, passengers could see the coastline, the bay, and the neighborhoods of Queens sliding underneath as the airplane turned and climbed away from the airport. Then the aircraft began to feel the disturbed air left by the larger jet. Wake turbulence is like the wake behind a boat, but in 3 dimensions. As Flight 587 passed through the trailing vortices of the 747 ahead, the airplane experienced rolling and yawing motions. This was not unusual in itself. Modern airliners are designed to handle brief encounters with wake, and pilots are trained to ride out those motions with smooth, measured control inputs. In the cockpit of Flight 587, the first officer was flying. As the aircraft began to roll and yaw in the wake, he responded with large, rapid movements of the rudder pedals. Instead of small, damped corrections, he pushed the pedals alternately left and right, trying to counter the swinging motion of the tail. On this aircraft, at that speed, those rudder inputs generated powerful side forces on the vertical stabilizer, the big fin at the back of the airplane. The combination of wake turbulence and aggressive rudder reversals drove the loads on the tail far beyond what it was designed to handle. Inside the cabin, passengers would have felt the airplane rocking more sharply than usual, with sudden swings and side-to-side movements. Some may have thought it was just turbulence. The timeline from that discomfort to disaster was brutally short. In the space of seconds, the stress on the vertical stabilizer reached a breaking point. The composite structure that attached the fin to the fuselage failed. The entire tail, including the rudder, separated from the top of the fuselage and fell away into Jamaica Bay. When the tail went, the airplane lost its primary way of keeping the nose pointed straight. The airflow around the remaining fuselage and wings became violently unstable. Engines mounted under the wings were also subjected to extreme forces as the aircraft began to yaw and roll uncontrollably. Both engines eventually tore away from the wings as the violent motion continued. From the ground in the Queens neighborhood of Bell Harbor, people looked up and saw a sight they would never forget: an airliner descending in pieces, leaving behind trails of smoke and debris. Without its vertical stabilizer, and with both engines gone, the Airbus was no longer really flying. It was falling. The fuselage hit the residential area with immense force, destroying houses and starting fires among closely packed homes. There were no survivors on the airplane. People on the ground also lost their lives as their houses were struck and engulfed. In total, 260 people on board and 5 people on the ground were killed. Given the date and place, the immediate reaction for many was fear of another deliberate attack. A large airliner had just fallen into a New York neighborhood, only weeks after the World Trade Center catastrophe. Investigators and the public were asking the same question. Was this terrorism, or was it something else? The investigation, led by the National Transportation Safety Board, found no evidence of a bomb or missile. There were no characteristic explosive damage patterns, no traces of an attack. Instead, the wreckage and flight recorders told a more technical and in some ways more unsettling story. A structural breakup triggered by control inputs during wake turbulence, magnified by the way the airplane's rudder system was designed and by how pilots had been taught to use it. Engineers reconstructed the separated vertical stabilizer and studied the attachment points where it had joined the fuselage. They found clear signs of overload, not manufacturing defects or progressive fatigue. The composite lugs that held the tail to the airframe had failed because the side loads had simply grown too large in a very short time. The flight data recorder showed a sequence of rapid, alternating rudder pedal movements at high airspeed, well beyond what the tail could tolerate when combined with the effects of the wake. At the same time, investigators looked closely at the design of the rudder system and the information given to pilots. The airplane's systems allowed full rudder deflection even at higher speeds, and the forces felt at the pedals did not rise steeply enough to warn a pilot that they were commanding extremely high loads. Training material in use at the time also suggested that aggressive rudder use could be a valid way to counter strong turbulence, without fully spelling out the structural limits. The result was a dangerous gap, an aircraft that could generate very large side forces with apparently modest pedal effort, and pilots who believed that strong rudder inputs might be appropriate in a wake encounter. In its final report, the investigation concluded that the primary cause of the accident was the in-flight separation of the vertical stabilizer after excessive rudder pedal inputs in response to wake turbulence. Contributing factors included aspects of the design of the rudder system and the airline's training programs that did not adequately explain the risks of large, rapid rudder movements at high speed. After Flight 587, airlines and regulators changed the way they talked about and trained for rudder use. Pilots were taught that at higher speeds the rudder should be used carefully and rarely, and that small inputs are usually enough to keep the airplane under control. Training scenarios were updated to show that over-controlling with rudder during turbulence can be far more dangerous than the disturbance itself. Manufacturers and regulators also reviewed design and documentation to ensure that control systems do not quietly invite pilots to command loads that the structure cannot safely withstand. In this video, we went back through some of the most infamous plane crashes in American history. Different years, different airlines, different causes. But the pattern is the same: a small crack in a metal disc, a missed checklist line, ice on a wing, turbulence that looks ordinary until it is not, ordinary days that turn into dates no one ever forgets. Aviation did not get safer by luck. It got safer because every one of these disasters was taken apart piece by piece, written into new rules, new training, new designs, and new habits in the cockpit and on the ground. The people who were lost on these flights are the reason millions of other passengers step off airplanes safely today. If you want more calm, detailed stories like this instead of random crash compilations, you can really support the channel by liking the video, subscribing to Terra Obscura, and leaving a comment about which case surprised you the most. It helps more than you think, and it tells the algorithm that careful aviation documentaries still matter.